Hi everybody, I'm Dennis. Welcome back to the Marbling Studio. Today I want to show you in detail the process of making marbled papers like these. If you're new to the series and start to feel a bit mystified, just pause the video and go check out part 1 on tools and materials. But before we start mixing size and throwing paint, let's take a moment to talk about what to expect for your first marbling session. Getting ready. If you've seen part 1, then you probably figured out that marbling isn't the sort of thing you pick up while waiting for your soup to cool off. You'll ideally want to block off at least half a day for your first session. To make the most of your time, there are a few things you should do in advance to get ready. If you have a dedicated space for marbling, that's great, but if not, you can still plan your workflow. Determine where you'll position the tray, the prepared paper, the rinsing station, and the drying area, and if necessary, decide how you'll keep them from getting splattered with paint and size. Remember, drop cloths are your friends. Strips of waste paper are essential to keep the size clean. Newspapers are a convenient source for these, so start gathering them a few days ahead until you have a good supply. I use a paper cutter to cut mine into even strips, but tearing along the grain is just as good. You'll want 2 or more strips per print you intend to make, plus more for general skimming, so get a bunch ready so you don't have to panic in the moment. You'll also want to have a waste receptacle handy for those once they've been used. It's a good habit to make note of everything you do before, during, and even after your marbling sessions. Careful record keeping will help you to repeat your successes and course correct on trouble spots. My marbling notebook isn't beautiful, but it is invaluable, and every stain and splatter is a badge of honor. When thinning heavy body paints with water, they tend to be rather chunky at first and can benefit from a bit of time to smooth out. This is also a great time to mix custom colors if you're so inclined. I'll go into the details of paint prep a bit later, but consider getting your colors ready up to a week or more in advance. Marbling isn't an exact science, so it's best to approach it with an open attitude of exploration and discovery. The method I'll be showing is one that I've used for years with reliable results. That's not to say that it's infallible, so odds are your first attempts could be a little disappointing. Be ready to adapt my techniques to your own circumstances as needed. Most problems stem from a few common issues though, which I'll discuss at the end of the video. Mixing size. The final thing to prep is mixing the size, and since doing that can't really be rushed, it should be the starting point of any marbling session. If you're using methyl cellulose, you can add mixing it up to the getting ready list we just went through, as it will stay usable for weeks. For Carrageenan though, I'd recommend mixing it up precisely the night before. The steps for mixing these are very similar, but each has its own idiosyncrasies, so let's start with how to mix methyl cellulose. To begin, we'll measure out the dry methyl cellulose powder. If your product comes with mixing instructions, by all means follow those, but in general I've found that 12 grams of dry powder per liter to be a good starting point. It's better for your initial mix to be too thick than too thin, as you can easily dilute it with water later. I'm making a 2-liter batch, so I'll heat up half of my water to start the mixing. It doesn't need to be boiling, just hotter than bath water is fine. You can use cold water as well, but the powder will form clumps which will take much longer to dissolve. Using a mixing container large enough for the entire batch of size, I first add the warm water and then dump in all of the methyl cellulose. Using my paint mixer and drill, I'll give that a good spin for a minute or so. If you're using a blender or have an especially large amount to make, you can totally do this in batches. You could also just stir this by hand, it just might take longer. After a couple of minutes, the powder should be well dispersed and the size will be foamy and full of bubbles. Then gradually add in the cold water. You'll have to let it sit until all those tiny bubbles are gone. That'll take some time, up to several hours. Once they've disappeared, you'll be left with a nice clear fluid that flows easily. In consistency, you should be going for something similar to olive oil. I'll show you a trick later for how to make sure that it's just right, but in general, if it's thick like honey or shampoo, it should be thinned with water, mixed thoroughly, and allowed to clear of bubbles. If it's as thin as milk, you can add more methyl cell, but bear in mind you'll need to wait again until it's fully dissolved. In the previous video I mentioned that methyl cellulose does have its pros and cons, so let me talk about those here at the outset. Its biggest selling point is that it keeps well at room temperature, unlike Carrageenan, which will usually spoil in less than a week. While my paints generally behave well on methyl cell, the first color I apply always spreads in strange ways, following a sort of grain direction. This happens even if I mix up the size right before applying the paint. This effect isn't necessarily bad, but it can lead to little gaps or holes in the patterns, so it's not a deal breaker, but something to be aware of, especially if your goal is creating precise designs. Of greater note is that I've had trouble getting my paint to reliably stick to the paper when using methyl cell. Many of my usually prepared papers had paint bleeding off, resulting in prints that were pale, fuzzy, and washed out. My best results were achieved by letting the mordant dry fully on the paper and being very gentle when rinsing. This last is hard though, as the size tends to cling to the paper and needs a good deal of water to remove. I don't want to come off as saying that methyl cellulose is bad. It will absolutely float paint and can produce good results. Just bear in mind that if you're using it for your marbling, you might have to make some adjustments. Carrageenan. Mixing Carrageenan is very similar to mixing methyl cellulose. I found that about 14 to 20 grams of Carrageenan powder per liter of water makes for a good consistency. Again, it's easier to thin the size later, so err on the side of too thick rather than too thin. The powder is actually strangely hydrophobic at the start, and tends to form clumps as it comes into contact with the water, so it's best to add it gradually. I've tried both hot and cold water for this, and not found there to be a significant difference. The key factors are agitation and time. A blender is definitely an asset here. It incorporates the powder really well, but at the cost of a lot of bubbles. Otherwise, a paint mixer and a drill, or a good whisk and some elbow grease will do the trick. After a couple of minutes of mixing, I'll let it stand at room temperature. If there are still large clumps at this point, that's okay. They will gradually dissolve. Presuming I started in the early evening, I'll then stir it every couple of hours before leaving it overnight. By morning, it should have a light amber color, but will be otherwise nice and clear, with no significant odor. As with the methyl cellulose, you're looking for a consistency that's similar to olive oil. If it's too thick, you can add water gradually, mixing with your fingers until incorporated. To my mind, Carrageenan's ability to allow paints to flow perfectly makes it the ideal marbling surface. And that's why I've chosen to offer it in my Etsy shop. Marbling is hard enough as it is, so why struggle with anything but the best? Working with good materials will save you a lot of frustration. I'm not sure when or if I'll be able to restock this, so if you're interested, follow the links in the description to get yours. Regardless of the type of size you're using, you should pour it into your tray first thing on marbling day, especially if you've been keeping it in the fridge, so it has time to come up to room temperature. Preparing papers. Before you can start throwing paint and making prints, you'll need to prepare your paper. As far as timing goes, this should be done at a minimum from 1 to 2 hours in advance, as the mordant needs time to cure. Some marblers prepare their papers well in advance and store them long term, while others find that the mordant degrades over time. I haven't tried long-term storage, but when I use fully dry paper, I always find it becomes too stiff to lay smoothly onto the sides, and that it curls up immediately on contact. For this reason alone, my preference is to prepare my papers fresh for each session, and use them while they are still slightly damp and flexible. The first thing you'll need to do is mix up a solution of alum for your mordant. The exact concentration of the solution can vary depending on the paper being used, but I found that 25 grams of alum per 250 milliliters of water to be a good general strength. If your alum is in larger crystals, it can help to use hot water to get them to dissolve. Just be sure to let it cool down before using it. It might be cloudy once it's mixed, depending on what product you're using, which is totally fine. Before coating the papers, it's a good habit to mark what will later be the back sides of each sheet. The mordant will be applied to the opposite side, which will be the side that's printed. Marking the backs helps you keep track of which side is which. Working on a smooth surface, I place the marked side of the paper down and then use a sponge, I prefer a natural one, to wipe on the solution. I've seen this done with a wide brush or a sprayer, or even by totally immersing the paper in the alum, but I find the sponge to be quick and easy. I wipe first in one direction and then the other to make sure I don't miss any spots. You don't need to flood the paper, you're just looking to get it evenly damp. Depending on the paper you're using, you might want to give it a moment to relax at this point. I found that giving each sheet a little massage helps the fibers to settle and makes it easier to handle. Once the paper is nice and relaxed, I transfer it onto a bed of newspaper with the alum side facing up. I leave it there uncovered while I prepare the next sheet, And when that's ready, I carefully lay it on the first one, this time with the alum side facing down, so the two damp sides are touching. This may not be necessary for every paper, but it works for me. The next sheet is then laid alum side up, and then another facing down. In this way I build the stack up in pairs, smoothing them down as I go. Another method I've been trying out is to just make the stack as I go, first by applying mordant as normal to the first sheet, and then putting another sheet on top and carrying on from there. Watch out for ripples developing if you go this route, but it's a fair bit quicker, so I'll be trying it again. Typically I'll prepare between 10 and 20 papers depending on how long of a session I'm planning. I'd recommend 10 or 12 sheets if you're just starting out. When those are done, I put another layer of newspaper on top, and then a board to keep everything flat while the mordant sets up. It won't be effective if the paper is still wet, but a bit of residual moisture is okay, and I find that it makes handling the paper so much easier. When marbling on methyl cellulose though, I've had my best success with completely dry paper. It tends to fight back a bit and curl when it hits the sides, but that's preferable to the paint sliding off. Again, every paper is different, so be prepared to adjust as you go. Preparing the paints. The size is mixed and the papers are curing, so now is a good time to fine-tune your paints. If you haven't pre-thinned your paints, you'll need to do that now. Add water a few drops at a time, then gradually more as you get to the consistency of melted ice cream. As I said, setting aside for a few hours can really help that blend together. In that time the paint should thicken a little bit, but in this state it'll be much easier to fine-tune with more water and surfactant. Which colors you use are entirely up to you, but don't go too overboard if you're a beginner. Choose 4 or 5 colors with a mix of dark and light tones for contrast. The ideal viscosity of a marbling paint is often compared to whole milk. Very fluid, but still with some body, though this can vary depending on the paint, the size, and even the temperature. The only way to know for sure if it's right is to test it. To do this, skim your size, then place a drop of paint onto the surface and observe what happens. Doing so in a separate bowl or small test tray will help keep your main tray clean. If the paint sinks immediately, it's likely still too thick. Add water a drop or two at a time, mix it well, and then test it again. Once the drop of paint no longer sinks, begin adding surfactant, again 1 drop at a time, and mixing well. Test and observe what changes, continuing adding surfactant until a drop of paint spreads out to a width of 5 to 10 centimeters in a few seconds. Acrylic paints may spread without the need of surfactant, while gouache or watercolors will likely need some help. Once you have one paint dialed in, you can check the viscosity of your size. Place a couple of drops on the bath and let them spread. Then draw a narrow stylus through them and observe the movement. If the paint pulls back like a rubber band, your size is too thick. If it continues to flow around the tray on its own, it's too thin. Ideally, the paint should stop almost as soon as you lift out the stylus. Presuming your size is good, continue to thin and adjust your paints one at a time until they all float and spread successfully. As you add colors onto the size, each one has to compete with the combined strength of the surfactant in all of the previous ones. This can cause a paint that performed well on the test bath to start to sink, especially if it's the 3rd, 4th, 5th, or later color. In order to compete and spread properly, later paints must have more surfactant in order to push the earlier colors around. Keep this in mind as you use and continue to fine-tune your paints, and add extra surfactant to those that you want to use as finishing colors. Skimming the size. We're finally ready to go, but before we put down our first color, there's an important step that must be done before every print, and that's skimming the size. The surface of the bath is your canvas after all, so it's good practice to keep it clean. Even if it doesn't have anything visible on it, the size can develop a sort of skin after even just a few minutes. Skimming it removes this layer, as well as any stray flecks of dust that may have settled there. Luckily, skimming is easy. Take a strip of newsprint and stretch it across the width of the tray, with half of the paper touching the size and the other half held upright. You don't need to scoop into the size, a light touch is all you need. Draw it towards yourself to push any stray paint or contaminants to the end. Then lay the dry portion of the paper down where the unwanted stuff will cling to it. Lift it gently away and discard it, then repeat the process as necessary to catch any stray paint or bubbles. I usually skim twice for every print as a minimum. With that done, we're finally ready to lay on some paint. Applying the paint. Let's start with the traditional method of using a brush. I'm using fan brushes, though almost any brush will do. They'll just have different effects. Ideally, the brush should be able to hold a moderate amount of paint. Too much and it'll slop all over the place. Too little and you'll be flicking all day. Whichever kind of brush you're using, you'll probably want to practice a bit to get a feel for your own tools. Start by loading the brush with a bit of your first color and, holding it roughly a foot or so above the size, tap it against the edge of your opposite hand or something hard like a stylus or brush handle. The goal is to rain down fairly even-sized droplets over a wide area. Move around as you throw the paint to get even coverage. This is easier said than done, and if I'm honest, I'm not terribly good at it. But the result will definitely be random and organic, no matter your technique. When you're done, you'll have applied your base color, which will become more intense as more colors are applied. When choosing your next color, keep in mind that it can be good to try to alternate tones of light and dark, which will help the pattern stand out in the final print. As you throw the new paint, the first one will be pushed aside, which will increase its intensity. Continue to add colors as you see fit, but pay attention to how they behave on the size. Are the later colors struggling to spread out? You may want to add more surfactant to those. Too much though, and you might blow holes in your pattern, or worse, compress the existing paints so much that they sink, or run off the paper when printed. There is a limit to how much paint you can put on. When you're finished, you'll have created the first and most basic marbled paper pattern, called Stone. This can be printed as is if you like, or it can be the basis of a number of other classic patterns. Let's dress this one up a bit by making what's called the French curl. Using a pin or thin stylus, slowly trace spirals in the size. What were once blobs of paint are drawn out into leafy whorls. You can make them random or in rows, big, small, clockwise or counterclockwise, or all of those, whichever suits your fancy. Before we get to making a print of that, let's just take a look at the method of dropping paint instead of throwing. If you're working in a kitchen or other space you don't want to spontaneously redecorate, this method might be for you. It's pretty straightforward, but there are a couple of things to watch out for. First, try to avoid blowing bubbles in the paint. Bubbles and marbling don't play well together. Instead of making like a kid drinking chocolate milk through a straw, just squeeze the dropper gently, then put it back in the paint and let it fill part way. Keep your hand just above the surface of the size and gently squeeze the pipette to let the drops fall. Drops applied this way are much larger than those flicked from a brush, so letting them fall from orbit could really make them sink into the size. Try to keep pressure on the dropper until you're done or it needs to be refilled, because relaxing your pinch on it will suck air up into it and create bubbles. As before, keep adding your colors until you're satisfied. You can keep them in neat rows or spread them around randomly, that's up to you. When you're done, you might wind up with a bunch of fried egg patterns or a more random blob fest. If it's to your liking, then go ahead and print it, but first let me show you another classic pattern. Using a stylus, trace a series of parallel lines back and forth down the tray. Then, repeat that, but this time going in the opposite direction. The result is a pattern of loose chevrons, called gelgit in the Turkish marbling tradition, or simply zigzag in the West. This is a classic pattern and an essential step for several other more complex ones. But that's enough pattern making. Let me show you how to get the paint onto the paper. Making a print. Grab yourself one of your prepared papers, and if you've got them in a pile like me, make sure to put the cover back on. Check that the mark you made on the back is facing up so you print the right side. Hold the paper by opposite corners and let it drape down between your hands. When you're ready, bring one corner down to gently come in contact with the size. Then carefully lay the rest of the paper down in a single, steady motion. It's easier said than done, so it's not a bad idea to practice it a few times before committing to making the print. Before lifting the paper, take a moment to make sure that all four corners are touching the size, especially if your paper starts to curl. You don't have to let it sit there though. If everything worked as it should, the paint will have stuck to the paper the moment the two came into contact. Once you're satisfied, it's time to pull the print. If you're using a draining board, place it across the tray and then pull the sheet back onto it. Lift the edge of the board to let the excess size drain back into the tray, and take a moment to observe your work. Hopefully the colors have all bonded well to the paper. If you do see paint running off, it's no cause for alarm. You probably just have to make some adjustments, which I'll cover towards the end of the video. Rinsing and drying. For now, we'll assume that your print was successful, so you'll probably want to rinse your paper. This isn't strictly required for Carrageenan, but I do recommend it for methyl cellulose. Also, if your size is old, it could have residual paint floating in it, which you'll want to remove. The trick with rinsing is using low pressure. The paint is bonded to the paper, but until it's dry, it's still rather delicate, and a powerful jet of water or light abrasion could damage it. I find that gently pouring water from a jug is a good method, and if the paints are behaving well, then a quick rinse is sufficient. Whether you've rinsed your print or not, it will still be soaking wet, so you'll want to let it dry completely. This isn't complicated, but here are a few considerations. If you've used a good strong paper, you should be fine hanging your papers using clothespins or clips. Putting your clips on a coat hanger or dowel will make it easier than trying to juggle a sheet of wet paper like a piece of laundry. I made a set of sticks with clothespins glued on just for this purpose. If your paper is delicate, or you'd rather not go to the trouble, you can simply drape your papers over a line or something similar. They can also be laid flat, though they'll take longer to dry. Whatever method you use, make sure your papers have ample air movement around them, and that they don't touch each other or anything else as they dry. Also, you may want to put a drop cloth, newspapers, or a tray underneath them to help minimize the mess. Once your print is left to dry, the process begins once again. Head back to your tray and be sure to skim it twice before throwing on your next design. If your first print turned out great, then you won't need my encouragement to begin experimenting with colors and patterns. If things didn't go exactly to plan, then this is the time to make some adjustments. Common problems. Here are a few of the most common troubles that beset marblers, both new and experienced. None of the paint is sticking. If the entire design is running off the paper, the number one cause is not enough mordant. Did you apply alum to your paper? Did you allow it to dry long enough? Did you marble the correct side of the paper? If all of these are true, you may need a stronger alum solution. If you're using methyl cellulose, I'd recommend letting your papers dry completely before marbling them. Finally, you could try a different paper. It's possible your paper isn't suitable for marbling. Some of my colors are running, but the others are sticking. If some of the colors stick, but others are running off, chances are those colors have been squeezed into little veins or blobs, which can cause sinking or running paint. If so, then those colors probably don't have enough surfactant to compete with the other colors. My paints are sinking. Loop back to the section on adjusting the amount of water or surfactant to try to get your paint to float and spread properly. There are white spots on my prints. Small white spots are often caused by bubbles in the size or in the paint. Try to avoid creating bubbles when stirring your paint or using a dropper, and pop any that do occur with your finger, a dry tool, or the corner of a piece of newsprint. Large white spots are caused by air bubbles under the paper. Make sure your paper is relaxed and supple, and take care when laying it on the size. Check for bubbles before pulling your print, and if you see some, you can gently rub the back of the paper to try to get rid of them. There are pale lines on my prints. Jerky movements when laying the paper will cause waves in the size, which makes the paint coverage uneven. Try to be as steady and smooth as possible when making your print. Those are just a few of the many things that can be a headache for marbling. I'll do a more extensive troubleshooting video in the future, but if before that you find that you're struggling with something not covered here, then leave me a comment and I'll do my best to help you out. Cleaning up. Your marbling session will eventually come to an end, usually when you run out of paper, paint, size, or patience. Hopefully not that last one. But once that final print is hung up to dry, your brushes and droppers will need cleaning, the paints will need to be closed up, floors and work surfaces wiped down, all very conventional stuff. But what about the size? How you handle that at the end of the day will depend on the type of size you're using and what your ongoing marbling schedule looks like. Methyl cellulose size is very stable and will last for weeks at room temperature. Simply cover your tray to reduce dust and evaporation and leave it for next time. If you need to pack everything away, drain your tray into a container and wash up with soap and water. If your tray is large and heavy, a plastic jug cut in half makes for a handy scoop. Carrageenan requires a bit more consideration. If your studio is on the cold side, the size can be covered and left out until the next day. If it'll be a few days until your next session, I recommend transferring it into a container and putting it in the refrigerator. It'll need to warm up to room temperature before being used again, but in this way I've been able to extend the working life of my size. Eventually though, all good things must come to an end. Methyl Cell will probably get too filthy to use before it goes stale, but you'll know your Carrageenan has gone off when the paints will no longer spread and it begins to smell a little bit like low tide. When this happens, it's best to discard your size as household waste, as it's likely accumulated quite a bit of paint or other contaminants. If in doubt, refer to the waste handling guidelines for your area. Flattening papers. Your marbling's done, the studio is cleaned up, and your papers are as dry and crispy as autumn leaves. It's now time to flatten them out. The first and simplest thing I do is gather up the papers in as neat a pile as I can, which can be tricky, but with a little care you should be able to manage it. I then take the entire bundle and roll it up as tightly as I can, making sure not to fold down any of the corners. This puts pressure on all the papers and acts as an impromptu press, which right away will reduce the worst of the rippling. This will also allow you to tap the tube on the end as you unroll it to align all the sheets. I'll then lay them out and roll them up in the other direction, again to align the edges. After rolling them tightly for a third time, I'll put a few rubber bands around them and leave them like that for an hour or so. When I come back to them, the papers will still have a curl, but one that's uniform and far easier to deal with. The papers can now be laid flat under a board and put under weight for 8 to 24 hours, depending on the paper. I found that this method results in papers that are acceptably flat and perfectly usable. Marbled paper's association with books stretches back for centuries. Yet this specialized handicraft couldn't keep pace with the automation of the 20th century, and now is at risk of becoming a lost art in the 21st. In creating this video series, I hope to not only showcase the magic and beauty of paper marbling, but to foster its revival for the book arts and beyond. I hope you've enjoyed this initial foray, and if you have, it would mean the world to me if you could click the like button. Subscribing to the channel really helps too, and if getting notifications for new videos isn't quite enough for you, then you can find me on Patreon for extra content as well. As for me, I think I need to think up some projects for all these new papers that I've made, so hopefully I'll be back very soon with something new to share. So until then, I'm Dennis. Thanks for watching.